some of the lecture we made about what we can do with the supply chains in the future. But I also want to go broadly to discuss some other driving forces that we face beyond the pandemic, because at the same time we also have quite a lot of changes in terms of political tensions, and US and China trade war. At the same time, we also need to address some other emergency, including climate emergencies, helping the world to achieve sustainable development goals. And we also have lots of companies now asking questions about Industry 4.0. I'm going to go through some of this and then discuss a few what supply chain in the future might look like. Let's start with the COVID-19 pandemic. We know very well there's no way out of the crisis except we manage to vaccinate everybody, or at least most people, because at the moment we are still in the crisis and it doesn't look like the number of cases or death would slow down until we have enough vaccination. What comes after this is to recover from the economic downturns. We've seen lots of sectors not able to continue businesses, and there will be a lot more job losses and so on. And we also need to rebuild our health system, etc. Now, let me just quickly go through some of the implications we have seen so far because of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the left upper corner, you can see businesses has gone down significantly because people do not go shopping physically anymore. You can see the GDP growth so far has been negative in most countries, except a few those that managed to control the spread of the pandemic. And then also a few from the African countries that was not affected at that time when the graph was built. But now actually the increases in cases are also mostly coming from those countries that were affected a bit later. We can see unemployment rate has significantly increased in many countries, and there are a few countries that managed to borrow their way out, paying the workers even though they do not work. But there are many other countries that actually just let the worker goes back home and suffer from definitely no income. That includes some of the workers in Bangladesh, textile workers sent home and are not able to have income for a year or so. What is surprising to see is that we can see all the bad news about the economy, but the only thing that goes up is the share market. It actually somehow shows us there are significant inequality in wealth, and that also affects the way in which lower income people in countries suffering more from the pandemic than the higher income group of people. So let's then think about what this means to the supply chain. The supply chain cannot continue with no demand or low demand. They cannot sustain, then they will continue either closing down or retrenching their people. What do we do with supply chain when you have this kind of situation? What I have learned from different companies is that they recognize the kind of disruption facing caused by pandemic is not the same as the types of disruption they used to face before. In the past, if you look at pre and no pandemic column, lots of disruptions were quite easily expected. They were, even though unplanned, they were one-off in an isolated location. One supplier, two suppliers having some problem with the operations. It's usually one-off. It's usually locally contained. You can sort of find temporary substitutions and quickly recover back to the original structure of the supply chain. And many of us would still continue with our preferred supply chain strategy, just in and global supply chain, global source if possible, just in time if possible. And that's because the disruptions propagate along the supply chain tier from particular locations downstream and easy to identify, contain, and find alternatives. Most companies do not go beyond the first-tier suppliers when it comes to monitoring risk, because they know it is quite easy to contain disruption. So they rely heavily on first tier to tell them if there's any problem up in the lower tiers. They rely on monitoring and the first tier, or if they have to influence the second tier, only when needed. That means the management of supply chain was quite less demanding. But what happened today is different. During the pandemic, there are recurring lockdown measures in different countries. At one point, lots of companies say, let's move out the supply chain, move supply chain out from China because China started to have the pandemic. But then they realize later on, wherever they go, the pandemic follows. Yeah. So all this recurring lockdowns measure means the disruption is not locally contained. It's moving from one place to another. So it becomes globally recurring disruption rather than a regional one. So the recovery becomes very slow. And in some point, the supply chain is not being disrupted and you can recover easily. It is being discontinued. Discontinued means there's no way for you to buy something from a particular supply base. And maybe the entire supply base is disappeared. So new supply chain must be created. The new supply chain could be local, could be elsewhere, could be different types of products and materials. That become quite demanding in terms of managing the switching of the supply chain to a new one. And there were a lot of discussions, as I heard from discussions just now, a lot of companies started to think about having to have more regional local supply chain than the global one, or having both at the same time. That's because lots of companies realizing that you cannot have just one supply chain, because you need to continue monitor the spread of the disruption. It's not just going along the tier, following the products in terms of disruption, but now it's human contacts, travel that spread the virus. So some of the companies I work with say they need to know where their first, second, third tier suppliers are, in which country, and they need to continue monitoring the number of cases and deaths and lockdown measures in different countries, so that they might be able to guess what would happen to those supply chain in different countries. So the monitoring visibility of supply chain become a huge challenge, because they need to monitor multi-tiers. They need to trace down the tiers, but also the way in which pandemic spread across country. And they cannot wait, because they have to do a real-time monitoring frequently. The last one is that most of companies realize that they cannot just sit and wait for first-tier suppliers to tell them something went wrong. And they have to monitor the multi-tier supply chains and direct influence, and even control if required. So for example, one aerospace company and the other automotive companies in the UK told me they have supply chains where lots of products and raw materials cannot be changed, because they are final product must use the same components for years to come. So the switching of suppliers become impossible. So then they have to go monitor the supply chains upstream to find out who is going to go bankrupt next, and who is going to have shortage of material or workers next. And in one case, the big companies even have to buy a tier 4 supplier, simply because there's no way for the tier 4 suppliers to survive anymore. So they have to buy the suppliers to make sure that they still survive. Otherwise, this single source supply chain will fail. And in many cases, you cannot have missing one component in the supply chain. So the supply chain in the short term, the next year, so will have to be very complex and multiple source, and also real-time monitoring and control of upstream if possible. I'd like to move on to a bigger challenge here because every time we have a disruption in our supply chains, we tend to say, well, yeah, it will go away in half a year and let's go back to the same supply chain structure. But there are lots of companies started to ask questions whether, simple adaptation is enough, whether you should start to mitigate. Mitigate means you really have to change and stop the cause of the problem or the pandemic in this case. Now, so let's look at this question about food production. What we realize is that our food production system has been very sophisticated and efficient. And you can see in this data, prices for chicken were cheaper in 2021 than 1997, if you even consider the inflation. So how could the supply chain be so efficient? Which is a good thing for many consumers, but the problem is, in the past, we have compromised this efficiency, knowing that food production systems that we have today actually account for lots of greenhouse gas emission, and lots of this efficiency come from government subsidizations of agriculture. So somebody paying a price outside of your consumer price to having cheaper meat. We know this system was not actually good for the planet as well as the overall economy, but we sacrifice that in order to provide cheaper chicken to consumer. Only until pandemic, people asked questions, was that really, the cost of the pandemic? Now, we do not have definite proof, but lots of scientists tell us that we rely on large-scale commercial agriculture for chicken protein productions, but many of the farms today are not built next to your house. They are built near to the forest by creating the forest, meaning that there are many other animals that can get close to the food we eat, the livestock we eat, and pathogens can spread more easily. So you have bird flu, you have pandemic caused by coronavirus. These are all partly because we make it easier for the pathogens to spread. The next thing is many of us do not perhaps so much aware of is that we're using lots of chemicals and antimicrobials to make the chicken grow very quickly. The chicken we eat from supermarket today are only 4 to 6 weeks old, but they were injected with chemicals to make them grow very quickly. However, this kind of antimicrobials also are similar to the one that the doctors use to human. And that means we are actually making the microorganisms more resistant to the same side of medicine that we use. So we will see an increased number of new viruses, and we will see resistance to our antibodies, etc. in the future. So we continue with the same food production system. But that's why I say maybe we should start to think about mitigations, and there are some governments started to ask these big questions. And a quick word about geopolitical tensions and the sort of a drive to deglobalize or nationalize the supply chain. We know very well that now China is rising as a new power against what used to be dominant by the United States, G7, and so on. That has created quite a lot of tensions, especially with America, who started not just a trade war, but also technology war, because the US president has asked questions whether it is safe for US to continue allow China to excel in some of the sectors I listed here. That means the United States has started to sort of sanction and control what technology can flow into China. They started to control, especially electronic sectors. In one way, this is affecting what happened in Thailand because you have a lot of electronic production. The wafer technologies that allow us in our phone to to run our programs effectively. The greatest IC chip that we use now is being separated in some of what can go into China and what cannot. And the other sectors like electrical and autonomous vehicles nowadays become a lot more popular. There's a trend likely that the number of electric cars will increase significantly and number of fossil fuel driven cars will reduce. That also has created a tension between the US and China, where there are a lot of pressures to move some of these electric car productions out from China to US. The political tensions also created lots of trade barriers in some of getting hold of minerals. For example, minerals for producing batteries, the energy sectors, and electronics. So this will create different types of supply chains which are bounded in region. Either you are in the US side or in the China side, and a lot of Asian countries are finding it difficult to really certify both sides and so on. So you see more and more regional and national supply chains instead of truly global supply chains that we have today. You can see more trade barriers in between some of the biggest economies and the other smaller countries. Trading with them will have to find ways to certify both, or maybe have to create two types of companies to certify both. I'd like to move on to a bigger pictures that affect the supply chain. Question is whether we just make some adaptation in supply chain. Is it enough? For example, let's change to LPG gas, let's install some solar energy panels, or let's use less polluting packaging materials. What we're doing here is enough to address climate emergency. There's this concept called climate tipping points that now people started to talk about, because we started to realize when the temperature of the planet Earth increased to a point, it has no return, meaning that it will start to heat up continuously, and they will see a lot of consequences, including flooding, including very serious extreme storms, and drought in some places, and so on. So this diagram gives you some indications what happened. Let's start with B. In the Arctic sea ice, where they started to become warmer. When people talk about global warming, 1.5 degree, today we are actually 1.1 degree warmer than 1960. At the point B, Arctic sea ice is actually warmer, more than 1.5, because global warming is not even. So there are places they are a bit warmer. What happened to melting of the sea ice in the Nordic Arctic region is that it makes the sea become less salty. It slowed down the Atlantic circulation. That slowdown in the Atlantic circulation sea also caused drought, especially in Amazon, because they are getting less cloud and rain going to air, which is Amazon forest. At the same time, Brazil is having quite a lot of crisis in terms of unable to control fires and the use of the land for agriculture that produce soya and other that feed our animals. So you can see one thing happen lead to another. If this continues, that also means many of the other regions will continue to have significant serious drought, like in Australia, in Chile, in Brazil. At the same time, you see huge storms in other regions, and that will destroy further our ability to produce food. And in the longer term, that also means sea level rising without our ability to slow it down, because this tipping point means we cannot go back to a lower temperature easily. So a lot of pressures now understand the climate tipping points, give us to think about what do we do with our different supply chains. One of the most important supply chains we all need to eat is the agriculture and food supply chain, where you will see drought and fires in some places that are very important for production of food. We see tensions between planting food to feed animals or humans, or producing biofuel. The fish stock has now reduced at the point fishermen are so desperate that they engage in illegal or environmental damaging fishing practices, and so on. You can see on the right hand side, you see more and more campaigns, people trying to force big companies like Burger King and McDonald's and so on, because of the meat production system that they use. We also see more and more what we call climate refugees. That is because some places become inhabitable, impossible to produce food. In the center of the Africa, in some places in Latin America, in other countries where it is impossible to live, and they have to move on to some other places. And then you can see more and more United Nations calling for donations, and humanitarian logistics become very important today. So a lot of countries responded to these climate issues by having new measures. Like, for example, Singapore wanted to be able to sustain themselves producing food, 30% of the food they consume by 2030. Also, company asked the question about whether they should have a shorter supply chain, whether they should then become the pioneer in having low carbon supply chains. For example, in the UK, we wanted to have more than 50% or more of the energy coming from renewable fuels, which we are going to achieve quite soon, and so on. The challenges we have, of course, is this kind of significant mitigation rather than just adapt, change a little bit kind of solutions. Is perhaps not enough. Lots of companies talk about, as well as country, net zero, a circular supply chain. But in reality, if you look at some of these discussions in the Harvard Business Review, but these are actually solutions that are very hard to realize. That's because the economy, we want to recover from the pandemic, we want to recover economy, it depends significantly on consumption. So far, there's a lot of campaigns that ask us to consume less, but it is virtually impossible. But we also have to learn a lesson that the way we structure our economy is in such a way that every percent increase in GDP rely on 3% increase in consumption. That is a very wrong model, because we can only make people live comfortable by having increased consumption. That is not the problem we're facing today. So we are facing a lot of challenges in terms of finding a way to create circular economy, reduce consumptions, and identify sustainable material that become a challenge. The changes that we can see in the supply chains include a significant transition from fossil fuel supply chains to a non-fossil fuel one. Today, we still have a significant challenge here because there are many oil companies trying to resist this pressure. And there are also efforts to look into using non-recyclable packagings, especially fossil fuel-based packaging like plastics, and then moving to a solution which is not going to fix the problem, because net zero means you can continue to increase your emissions, but we have to pay carbon capture technology to capture the carbons and put them into the ground. And these are actually not necessarily the best solution, but we are in a desperate stage to use this in order to reduce the temperature rise. A quick run through about Sustainable Development Goal. Well, many of us in the supply chain sectors, don't really think this is part of our job. No, our job is to produce and supply to consumers and make profit for companies. But lots of big companies have started to think carefully what the purpose are when it comes to their responsibility in achieving Sustainable Development Goal, such as no poverty, zero hungers, equalities, and so on. Well, most of us, in terms of research, we focus a lot on number 9 because we look at innovations, we look at how industries can create growth, and we build infrastructures to support our logistic and supply chain operations. Many of us should start to think about the others because big companies have started to ask that question as well. Just to give you some indications what big corporations are thinking, perhaps you should start to think whether some of the big companies has changed their missions or vision. In this case, let's look at some of the examples. Unilever, for example, has a purpose to make sustainable living commonplace. The company actually uses lots of chemicals and plastic, and they have to learn and transform the supply chains to make sustainable living commonplace, meaning that the chemicals they use or the plastic they use become less polluting. That's a challenge they have to face with themselves. Let's look at other companies, for example. Nike was created back in the 1950s. At that time, there were other competitors, Adidas, Puma, and so on. Nike was created with a purpose to crush Adidas, as you can see in the small print here. But Nike today is the leader in the footwear sectors. They have changed their mission significantly. They want to move the world forward through the power of sport, breaking barriers, and so on. So they have actually tried to change significantly in terms of what they want to address or known for. And you can see most of these missions have started to change towards creating societal value. I'd like to draw your attention to another company called The Body Shop, started in the UK by a lady called Anita Roddick. She started the business by selling makeup and similar products using natural ingredients. And she then later on built the companies to make it more sustainable. She realized her passion is more about making the world more sustainable. If you look at the quote on the left here, businesses should not just about money, it should be about responsibility. And it's not about greed, it's about public good. The Body Shop was later on sold to other companies that have a very different purpose. The company purpose was basically to make as much money as possible. The people working in Body Shop found it extremely difficult to cope with this new owner, and new owner found it very difficult to transform the company because the company actually having quite different purposes compared to simply just to make money. The company that bought this company, Body Shop, now sold the company to another company called Natura, and that would allow this Body Shop to go back to their roots, started by Anita, in which they say they want to they exist because they want to fight for a fairer, more beautiful world. Fairer, referred to today's inequality, especially women, and then beauty product for women, and they wanted to make this a fairer world. That actually, indicates lots of things now is shifting in terms of their purpose to serve to achieve a sustainable development goal. Now we can afford to be very cynical about this company because they still want to have to make money because they have shareholders, but they at least started to show some change in terms of the way they drive the company. So just for a conclusion, the future trends in supply chains, one is adaptations, meaning that you have to be more aware of the risk you are facing, real-time monitoring, multi-tier monitoring, adapt and learn very quickly and change very quickly. But this is not enough because the pandemic today would continue, and there might be more that can be, more damaging and challenging. And also we have the climate change issues to face with. We see multi-regional supply chains temporarily. I'm not sure how long this is going to last, but at least there will be some adjustment in terms of regional versus global supply chains. There will be some supply chains that cannot be wholly just in time and lean, and so on. The focus now in some big companies is actually mitigation. Stop all the challenges they're facing today, including the pandemic, the different disruptions, and also the climate change. The purpose of the corporation started to change from, they just want to drive efficiency, make as much money as possible for the shareholder, to they need to be more responsible for the environment and the society. So in terms of economic models, they start to think about what they could change in terms of the way their products are being produced, distributed, and consumed. So that drives lots of companies to think about having a supply chain that is more sustainable, or started to incorporate sustainability goal into their missions. That is especially important when big companies started to operate in what we call LMIC, low medium income countries. And that will be some of the challenges I see in terms of supply chain. All right, thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Chi Wong. I think it's a very good lesson for us. And what we can see that the world is changing very fast. So it's quite a pressure that we need to adapt. Thank you very much. Let me introduce Professor Ruth to share the thoughts or the lesson learned in terms of the future trend of supply chain management. And as Dr. Ruth is now Dean, so probably in the view of the education, curriculum, teaching, something like that. So if you can share, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ajahn Sakun, very much for having me here today. And thank you, the Operations Management Department, for organizing this particular event. It is always with great pleasure that I meet up with Chi. We do run into each other from time to time, but in reality, we don't really have much opportunity to talk between ourselves. But it's always a pleasure to see you. So when I've listened to Professor Chi's presentation, one of my biggest worry was that I would have nothing to say because he would have said everything. And well, certain things we do see, I think, from the same perspective. And there are maybe some other things that, for me, I think it's also quite important when we look at it from the perspective of logistics and supply chain trends. So I have a quick presentation. And in fact, the way how I did the presentation was based on the advice that I was given by the organizer, saying, oh yes, we'll have two rounds. The first round relates to the trends, and then the second round will relate to the research aspect. So when I looked at the trends, I think because of the COVID and because of everything that is happening at the moment, the immediate problem that we see is what I would call the capacity challenge, because everything is disrupted. And there's so many things that have happened this year, like, for example, the Everglow or the Everflow, the Evergreen container vessel being stuck in the Suez Canal. Then we have problems in southern China again. And all this is going to ripple through the whole supply chain. Then, of course, yes, e-commerce, something that is very, very important. And we have seen that e-commerce have grown a lot and has accelerated in its growth because of the pandemic itself. But one thing that we haven't really, I think, touched upon, it's the changing demographic, the people, the users, the consumers of logistics, or that needs logistics services that are in the supply chain, because the demographics have changed. And today we talk about the millennials, and sometimes when we look back, we see that they have a totally different perspective in the way of how they want to consume. And then I'll talk a bit about the technology and the impact of technology that we will probably see very soon. And then from a research need, and this is just from my own perspective, because logistics has a purpose to meet customers' requirement, supply chain meet end consumers' needs. So it's also important to look at these shippers' need and how can you actually have control over your supply chain. Professor Chi was saying that now you even have to go back through, tier 3, tier 4, but how do you actually coordinate all of that? So maybe one of the ways to move forward and to look from a research perspective, it's looking at developing or implementing control towers. Another thing that I think is quite interesting, it's all this trend in outsourcing, where now we start seeing supply chain as a service. And then I'll finish off a bit with supply chain sustainability, which is something that Professor Shi has touched upon. And I will just share some points that I've been looking at from a research perspective. So as a starting point, this capacity challenge, it has always been a big problem to match supply and demand. And with global supply chain, I think we are all too familiar with the challenges of managing a global supply chain. The problem is in fact, these supply chains have become very fragile. And because of the pandemic, but because also of other events around the world, we have seen total breakdown in these supply chains. Because of the pandemic, what you also notice is that a lot of the support services that in fact facilitate this physical flow, well, they have become subject to capacity limitation, because the freight or the demand for goods have reduced for certain commodities, but for other commodities, in fact, they have increased a lot. And now the big question is this: when we see the freight rates going up by 200, 300%, what is the actual impact for the consumer? I saw some numbers the other day where they said, yes, if it's electronic goods, maybe you will see an increase in the price of the good by 3 to 5%. But then if it's, for example, you're in Europe and you're importing furniture from Asia, with the price of freight today, what is going to happen is that you will pay furniture at around over 50% higher price. So all this is because of this capacity challenge, and the prices of freight has gone up. In fact, at the moment, we could even say it's a revenge of the shipping line, because they're making so much money. They're making so much money from transporting, from moving those goods, and even at spot rate, it is very high. I see on my LinkedIn feed all my friends that are in the shipping sector, and they're all saying, "Oh, it's a new high," and every day it's a new high. So that is the first thing, because you don't have enough capacity. The second thing is this: is also from a shipper's perspective, the demand spikes, in fact, do not follow the traditional seasonal patterns that we used to be very familiar with. Let's say, for example, for us in Thailand, the high season, for example, to send goods to the US, is that the goods needs to arrive before Thanksgiving. So that means September, October is really the latest period where you send the good. And after that, it's a holiday. That means it's like there's no actual demand. But now this has changed a lot. And because of the pandemic, for certain type of commodities, the demand has kept on increasing, especially for electrical goods, consumer goods that you have at home. And these consumers, they have even more choice than ever before. The penetration of online shopping, the penetration of e-commerce have given them, in fact, a lot more opportunities to buy goods from within the country, but also from other countries. And this is where you see that the e-commerce buying pattern is becoming a larger mix of the total purchase in a household. And I can share, like, for example, in my house, because of the pandemic, every day, on average, I have about 5 courier services coming in and delivering goods. So that is not very good from a sustainable perspective, but this is what is currently happening. So the e-commerce exponential growth is, I think we are all very familiar with this. All I can say is this, is that the pandemic has just basically accelerated some of these main trends that we were hoping to see maybe in 2025, 2026, but it has arrived within a year. And it has become a big challenge for those traditional retailers who still rely on the traditional supply chain, because consumers have now a different option. So what we see today happening a lot more is this, what we call the omni-channel. And a lot of research has been done on omni-channel, or what they call O2O, online to offline type of distribution strategies. But still, we haven't really actually found the most effective, efficient model. And maybe that is because we don't look enough from the perspective of the consumers themselves, from the perspective of consumer behavior. So this is something that I think we are seeing quite a lot. And another thing that, in terms of trends, is this changing demographic, especially when you look at the population and this issue of megacities. There was a study done by, I think, the World Bank, where it says by 2030, 50% of the population in Thailand will be urbanized. So what does that mean? So we know that the biggest city in Thailand is Bangkok and its metropolitan area. And this poses very, very complicated challenges from a logistics perspective. Because in urban planning, in urban design, logistics is quite often an afterthought. No, they think about it later, or they don't even think about it. And a lot of these big megacities, their growth has been organic. If you look at Southeast Asia, we have Jakarta, we have Manila, and we have, in fact, a lot of megacities. And this, I think, will be something that is very, very challenging from a logistical perspective, especially for the last mile logistics. Let me share with you, for example, if you look at a city like Jakarta, from the port to the city, on average, a truck cannot even do a round trip. It's basically a trip and a half per day. So that makes it even more expensive to do the delivery into the city. And because of the pandemic, now we have this situation where people work from home, and that provides, in fact, a lot more freedom, but that will also stress the logistics network, because people may not really need to be in the cities anymore. So you have like two conflicting type of attraction. On one side, the mega cities attracting more and more people, and then you also have people who would like to get away from these mega cities, but still to have the benefit of being able to consume as if they were in a mega city. So that is going to be quite challenging. So e-commerce and COVID, like I was saying a few moments ago, is that it has accelerated the trend. We were already seeing these trends, but it has actually accelerated the trend. The challenge is this, is when we look at e-commerce, we basically see two things. One is, of course, the e-commerce platform, and all of them are, in fact, actually losing money. But what they're trying to do is to have customer loyalty so that people just come in and buy on the platform. But then you have the other side of the coin, or what I call the back office of the e-commerce platform, which are the suppliers, the logistics service providers. And we have seen, like in the case of Thailand, one service provider achieving a unicorn status, and then another service provider sending a letter to their customer saying, oh, we're going out of business. So this is, again, going to be quite interesting if we look at it from the perspective of, at the end of the day, how many of these service providers will be left in the market. That is going to be, I think, something very, very fascinating to look at. Should the government come in and control, regulate? Personally, I don't think so. Let's have market forces come into play. But because the way how business models are developed today, a lot of the startups just require funds to keep on going. And after a while, they will sell the business. And maybe that's not really very good from a sustainable perspective. If we look at technology, and here are some of the trends that I see that can impact the supply chain, I don't think that's very innovative from what I see. We're familiar with this technology called 3D printing. And what does it do is that it can help do mass customization and decentralized production. But then that will mean that there will be more last mile shipping. But then the good thing is you will not need to have the spare parts. You will not need to keep the inventory as long as you have the blueprint. Then the Internet of Things, the connection with the production floor, and then this visibility, which everyone is talking about, that we need to be able to see what is happening along our supply chain. But the IoT can also be used for the monitoring the usage of equipment and the employees, especially if the employees are working from home and you do not want their productivity to go down. Then unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, we are now seeing a lot of, I think, commercials or examples of trying to do urban, not just last mile, but also first mile to do the pickup, and looking at drones to do the rural delivery and the surveillance of infrastructure. And maybe this next technology will be very important for the future for us, is driverless vehicle, both for freight and passenger, because the insurance firm in the UK, AXA, basically calculated that you'll be able to save about £34 million because you will reduce the number of accidents. So if you see here, what you notice is that, yes, technology is coming in and it is going to impact the direction or the way how the supply chain will be. Because of the pandemic, because of these disasters, what we have seen is that these technologies are in fact coming a lot faster than what was expected. And what we see also is that when technology comes in a lot faster, usually governments have difficulties in understanding, and they don't even know, and they don't even understand in terms of how it could be regulated, or should it be regulated or not. So this is just from my first part into the round one. So I just want to ask the moderator if you want me to continue, go in one go, or should we stop here, take some questions, and maybe go back to the research aspect later on?
Okay, thank you, Ajahn. I think we can stop here and get some question or comment before we move on to the round two. So we can focus on the future trend, industry trend, on supply chain management issues. Professor Wong, anything you want to add first before we go for Q&A for this session?
No, thank you, Lutz, for covering some of the technology part. I think we should perhaps have a discussion with people.
Okay, thank you both of the panelists. I think today we have a very good combination of participants. We have the people from academic, and also we have the people from industry, some professional association in supply chain management, something like that. So please, if anyone have any question or comment, anything you want to add on or you want to ask, please do so. Anyone have any question or comment for the first round? Any comment, question? Okay, so we can wait a bit and we can move on to the round two, and then I think at the end probably we have some question or comment on this. Before we move on to the round two, I have one quotation from a very good idea on this. Actually, this is a message from Professor Nada Sanders from Northeastern University. And she said that we are in a race with the virus. We know enough that we cannot seal the borders. And when we look at what's happening around the world, the whole economy will be impacted. The virus is seeking mutation. We really are in this together. So I think as Professor Wong mentioned about the pandemic is not over, it continue to the third wave, fourth wave. So I think the message that we get from both panelists, I think is a high pressure that we need to adapt ourselves in terms of the industry, in terms of the supply chain management and future trending direction. So I think in the future, the firm will compete each other based on this pressure. If you can do this better, probably you can have a competitive advantage at the end. So I appreciate the message from Professor Ruth and Professor Chi Yu Wong on the future trend and industry. It's a very good one. Okay. So right now we try to condense a little bit from the industry trend, from the future trend on supply chain management, and then we focus on the research direction or probably the publication. As Ajahn Ruth and Ajahn Chi Yu, both of them are involved in the academic services like editor and reviewer and the advisory board. So I think let Ajahn Ruth start first with the round two on the direction of research, and probably any idea on the publication, on the something like scholarly work, something like that. Please.
Thank you. I think before I start, we have a chat function. So if people don't feel comfortable in asking the question online verbally with the camera on, I think you can always ask questions via the chat, and then we can answer them. I think that is another way to communicate. So allow me again to go back and share my screen. And this is what I would like to say. When we look at it from a research perspective, it is very, very challenging because we're living in this world where the research that is done needs to be published. And I know that many people, or there is some thinking now that maybe publication even isn't everything. But at the moment, that's probably the only thing that we know as academic that reflects our impact on the body of knowledge that we are working on. So if we look at from a research perspective, and this is just, I would say, my perspective, and I think it goes back to just an observation. When I go through a number of papers, in various journals, I've noticed one thing, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Professor Chi can say that I'm wrong, but a lot of the research that I have seen don't really focus very much on the need of the user of the logistics services, the need of the shippers. I don't see that a lot. I used to see that maybe in the 1980s, 1990s. So I don't know if it's really because everything has been done before, or is it because no one has really touched upon it? But when you think about what is happening today, especially with the technology that we have, I would say that shipper and understanding the type of data that shipper requires or consignee requires, I think it is very important. And we have seen the emergence of some concept such as synchromodality, which comes from the Netherlands, where they try to look at multimodal transport, integrated multimodal transport as a new way to provide transportation services. So here I'm just saying, okay, when we look at data, probably we need to be more interdisciplinary and not just looking at it from, for example, from an accounting or finance perspective, but also operational data that can help shipper optimize the movement of the cargo. So such as the date, the weight, the cost broken down, chargeback amount, origin destination codes, freight moved by contract or spot contract. So all of this, I think, needs to be probably better understood from the requirement of the user. So that I would say that will be one aspect of the research that I would like to see going. Then the second, we talk a lot about managing the supply chain, especially the extended supply chain, where you have the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Sometimes we even go as far as the tier 4. But how can we actually manage, control, monitor, and evaluate? And this is maybe something where we see this concept of control tower coming in. And I know it's not new. The private sector has control tower, but the coverage of the control tower, because if we really want to be able to monitor and evaluate or change anything if something happens, you need to be able to see your end-to-end supply chain. How can this be done? Well, you have so many softwares in the market, ERPs, WMS, TMS, but then the challenge will be, how do you actually integrate all of these different software? Because it is very important to be able to see. If you do not see, you're like a bit of a blind man trying to ride an elephant, and you don't know which way the direction where the elephant is going. So this is, I think, something very important. And when we look at it, it's all about this supply chain, the whole network. How do you actually manage the whole network? So I think this is something that could be seen as another trend from a research perspective in terms of actually how to move forward. And I have a very clear reason why I'm raising this example, because for me, logistics supply chain research, of course, theory is important, but at the end of the day, the implementation aspect, what can the practitioner get from our research is very, very important. Supply chain as a service is, again, another concept. It's another concept where we are very familiar with outsourcing, and firms do outsource lots of things. So why not? Is it possible to look at supply chain as a service with specialized firm and coming in, managing the supply chain for you, because they have the capability to link the information with the various stakeholders in the network? So this should also be something that I think could be explored from a research perspective. And of course, the digital supply chain, everyone is talking about the digital supply chain. And yeah, this is true. This is a direction where we're going, and we would probably need to see more research on it, especially from an implementation perspective, but also the benefit that is obtained from the digital supply chain. Because at the end of the day, you have to go back and see if this digital supply chain, how will it enhance the competitiveness? How will it enhance the financial viability of the supply chain itself? So these are, I think, just example from my side in terms of what type of research we can look at in supply chain management. But sustainability, and Professor Chi was talking about it a few moments ago, is probably, I think, the biggest theme at the moment. We have the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, and even at the university level, because now I'm also an administrator, the university has target for SDG, Sustainable Development Goal. And in the target, they say, and I'm sharing this with my colleague from operation management, so they will ask you, the university will ask you through the faculty, in your curriculum, in your topic that you're teaching, which topic addresses which sustainable development goal. So that's the first part. Second part is the research that you do. Which topic or which research that you're doing are addressing which sustainable development goal. It's true, usually for us in the business school, it used to be more on the sustainable goal number 9, but then you have so many others. So we would need to do some sort of catalog and stock taking of what is currently being done. But allow me to share with you some of my thoughts related to supply chain sustainability. So yes, environmental, social issue, more and more critical in the global supply chain, but even in shorter supply chain like regional or national, local supply chain, these are very important issue. And 2 days ago, I saw an announcement, and I don't know if you're aware of this, is something that has happened in Germany. In Germany, there is a new law called Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. What does that mean? It means that firms in Germany, German firms, the large firms, need to make sure that their supply chain, the stakeholders, the suppliers in the supply chain, do not use, for example, child labor, that they are environmentally conscious. And this is, I think, quite interesting, because this is the first time you see this happening as a law. And maybe because in Europe, there's a very strong emphasis on the environment, on sustainability, they're going to trickle this down. So, and it will go up to tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4. But we still don't know the impact yet. What will happen if a German firm does not comply with the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act? Of course, it will be fined, and the amount will be a lot higher. So that forces us, I think, in developing countries also, yes, for our SMEs, for our suppliers, then that becomes quite challenging, because we also have to be at level, or at least compliant with such laws. And I think we'll see more and more of these laws. And because Europe has been moving so much in terms of the environment and sustainability, and Professor Shi must be very familiar with this word, is decarbonizing, which I think has been coined by Professor Alan McKinnon. And he's been going on about decarbonizing supply chain, freight transport, and all these things. So we do see that a lot coming in. And yes, the circular supply chain. My observation on circular supply chain, and from the Harvard Business Review paper, why don't we see more of it, is because it's very challenging to design a circular supply chain from the beginning. And in fact, I wrote one paper where I tried to explain, but that paper is in Thai. I published it in Thai, but it's not in English, where I basically said that if you want to develop a circular supply chain, that means that your circular supply chain is in fact a closed loop supply chain. So in order to have this closed loop supply chain, you need to have a good reverse logistics system. So trying to put in some sort of typology in it. Then we see alternative fuel coming in. And again, that's all about sustainability. And we can see there was a research that I did, which is on the impact of electric vehicle on the automotive supply chain. So all these new alternative energies coming in, what is their impact on supply chains? This is something that I think would be interesting to see. Professor Shi touched upon food supply chain, and I just would like to highlight that it's like two sides of the same coin when we talk about food. You have food insecurity, and then you have food security. And that is, again, something that maybe we do not talk enough about, but we have seen that during the COVID pandemic, that access to food was a big issue in many countries, especially for those that are in, I would say, the bottom of the pyramid or in the lower echelons of society. And last point, again, going back at humanitarian supply chains here, it's this issue of resilience. I'm working with a colleague who is based at Thammasat Business School, Dr. Ali, and we're working on such issues of resilience in humanitarian supply chain, because we do see that a lot of the work that is being done, it's in terms of the preparedness, in terms of the response, but then is the supply chain actually resilient? That is, I think, a big question. So my last point is this, is we're talking about research and we're talking about publication. So I just have 3 keywords to share. Because it's research, the validity and the rigor is critical. But because logistics and supply chain is an applied discipline, I would also like to add the impact, especially the impact for the practitioners, for the people that are in the industry. Because if we do research that is valid and rigorous, but it is just for us, then it's nice, but it is not sufficient. It is not sufficient. And probably we would also need to think of ways of how we can share our research and make it more understandable to other people. Because if not, then we become just, self-serving, and we'll just be in our own group. So I think with this, I'll just end my presentation and hope I've opened some food for thought so that we can continue the discussion. Over to you, Professor Sakun. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Professor Ruth. I think the very precise and but powerful message that he presented the future research in the research trend. I have one message from Dr. Thananya, I think from Mahidol University, and she talked about the challenge of tourism supply chain that will be complicated as the pandemic, the COVID-19 evolve. She said it's not a question, but she would like to hear some idea from both of you about the tourism supply chain and COVID-19 involved that can impact, can affect the supply chain. Any comment or idea, Jan Ruth, for tourism supply chain about this?
Thank you. I have a slight issue with this concept of tourism supply chain. Okay, it's why do I have an issue is because it's not actually a supply chain. It's really a network, and of course the network that we have seen has been completely broken down by the pandemic. But it's a multi-layered, a multi-dimensional, a very complex problem because it relates to the tourists who are the customers. Then you have the service providers, where you have so many different types of service providers. And then you have this regulatory environment where it is very, very confusing. I think one good thing to do would probably be to map out the whole tourism supply chain at the moment and which are the key drivers so that we can address some of the issues that tourism supply chain is facing. So this is just not a response, but just an observation.
Thank you.
May I just add my view here?
So.
Yesterday in the UK, we had discussions by the aviation sector trying to urge our Prime Minister to save them. That's because they have not been flying for more than a year. Yes, tourism is a very important part of the economy in lots of the countries, including Thailand. To some extent, in Europe, governments are willing to help some of the aviation and tourism industry. So they will sort of keep them alive until we vaccinated enough people to allow them to travel again. And this will have to rely heavily on the government, even though the private sectors, have been very important. But in this kind of crisis, you really have to rely on the governments. The second thing I saw is that there were some tourist destinations trying to innovate out of the crisis. For example, some museums organize sort of online events and ask people to pay a fee to join the sort of virtual tourism. Somehow, they want to make sure people remember that this is a nice place to go, and somehow they want to continue to engage with the people who wanted to travel or see the world. Perhaps it actually create an opportunity for some more innovative companies or countries to create some sort of alternative to the physical tourism business model. Other than that, it's impossible to continue simply because they have so many lockdown measures, and then even though we see quite a lot of people now traveling, the Euro 2020 2021 football, you see so many people in the stadiums, but we know there will be consequences. Olympic in Japan, we know there will be consequences. So that is tourism in a very cautious manner is still going to be happening.
Thank you. I think we have several questions, but I will save until the end. So let's hear from Professor Wong first. IJPDLM is a very top journal actually in supply chain logistics management. And for your information, the impact factor 2019 is 4.744. Impact factor is quite very high impact factor in this type of journal. And Professor Wong is the editor of this journal. So we can hear from him about actually the research trend in supply chain is one part. And another part is about publication in high quality journal. So I will hand the Zoom to Professor Wong to share some thought, idea about research trend and about the journal publication too. Please.
Thank you, Sakun. I'm going to first introduce to you the journal, IJPDLM, very quickly. By doing so, I also try to highlight what we expect, so you can see perhaps some of the new expectations that come into the journal as well as the field as a whole. And later on, I will move on to broader issues rather than telling you which topic become popular. And that's because it is difficult to tell you, I will have my biased view about what is important topic and what is not. So let me just begin with the journal very quickly. I took over the editor of this journal back in April last year. The journal, even though it's called Physical Distribution and Logistics Management, it has quite a broad scope. We want to provide new insights about problems and techniques to not just academic, but we also want to inform consultants, policymakers, and business practitioners. Our topic is quite wide, not just about last mile or physical distributions, but also supply chain and even people issues, digitalizations, omnichannels, sustainabilities, and global trade, and so on. In some of the topics, so we are quite similar to other journals that cover supply chain management, logistic management, and so on. We accept all sorts of different methods. We are mostly empirical journals, and we cover empirical qualitative and quantitative methods, except mathematical modeling, like optimizations. We might consider them if they are a part of other methods. We also encourage conceptual theoretical paper, but we do not encourage literature review that simply focus on counting number of papers. We also encourage more nowadays mixed methods and use of design science or action research, more applied science kind of studies. We have regular issues where you can submit your typical research papers. And we also have a shorter section, which I will introduce you later on innovators and transformers. These are some statistics about our journal. And as Sakun mentioned about our impact factor in 2019. The impact factor for 2020 will be announced perhaps later in this month or early next month. We expect the journal to have a significant improvement in the impact factor, which means we are one of the leading journals in logistic management, and also we are one of the oldest because we started back in 1970, as always me. Now, we are very international. We receive submissions from more than 60 countries. We accept 40-50 papers a year. acceptance rates has gone down because we have started to become more demanding. And we are also a quick journals. Most of the papers go through 2-3 rounds of revisions, and if they get accepted, it's within a year. We give feedback very quickly to our submissions. Usually within a month or two, they get feedback from us, or if it's rejects, it's even quicker. And this is a bit about our review structure, just to give you some idea. We usually do an initial review by myself or my senior associate editors or section editors or so on. We don't have a meta review section like other journals because we cover all sorts of different methods, and we would use expert if they need to. We might just reject papers which are not appropriate out of the scope, not really logistical supply chain, papers that have flaws, and so on. We also unsubmit papers when they don't really meet our requirement. We now spend a lot more energy to papers that has potential. We give them very thorough review and constructive feedback because we know we do not want to send them for review. They're not ready yet, but we class them as reject and resubmit. So there will be quite a lot of papers we started to work on this direction because we want to make sure that we give chance to especially younger generation to get constructive feedback from us and maybe increase the chance of publishing in the demanding journal like us. When it is ready for review, we go to R&R, and usually 2 and more blind reviews are involved. The difference between the past and now is that for almost every paper, we will have a senior associate editor involved as an associate editor, but also as a reviewer. So you get the third reviewer, which gives you very constructive feedback, and also we aim to get you feedback within 30 to 45 days. Now, if you want to ask the questions why IJPDLM publish some papers, you can follow my LinkedIn, and because I usually highlight what practitioner can learn from the paper, especially, or we also highlight big questions that we ask out of the papers to academic, to challenge the academic, so that they can create new knowledge for real practitioner. And the new section that we introduce, which perhaps can be good news for people who are more in the practitioner applying research side. We call it innovators and transformers. We want people to highlight some new development in the supply chain or logistics sectors, which has significant implication to the practice. And you have to run it in a way that you stimulate new research where we can then have more the normal research papers to further understand the new phenomenon, and therefore we can create a new stream of research to transform the supply chain. So you can generate some new problems or new challenges or new innovation that you can see. For example, Ajahn will talk about e-commerce. Is there any new challenges, new phenomena, new business models that deserve more attention? For example, sustainable development goal, is there any challenges that we should, in the logistics supply chain discipline, address? How can we address them? So we also encourage you to work with business practitioners, policymakers, to write this kind of thing. Good news is we don't really demand the typical comprehensive methodology question. You only need to write 4,000 to 6,000 words for this kind of new section. Just to highlight a bit about some of our special issues, we cover all sorts of different areas in the special issues. The first 2 special issues here have now been concluded, and we are in the process of reviewing all the papers. We also have a new one. If you have case studies, in-depth case studies about COVID, and that is also what we encourage you to consider, which is closing on the 1st of October. So that's enough for introducing the journal. I want to have a broader picture about some debates we now engage in our field, broadly operation management, logistics supply chain management, and also management in general. Ajahn wrote, rightly pointing out the importance of impact here, because the field has in the past 20, 30 years focused a lot on theory. And everyone is very obsessed with asking questions when we accept a paper, do you have any theoretical contribution? But in my journals, I would argue that we sometimes consider papers that have only empirical insights and also only policy impacts and all society impacts without really focusing on just theoretical contribution. So there are a lot of questions about whether you should or you should not use theory. Of course, if you use theory, you have to use it in a way that you can advance the understanding of a phenomenon basing on the theory. The next issues we have is a lot of journals now started to move to a higher quality. When I say higher quality, some journals emphasize a lot more on rigor. That is the method you use. The method you use should try to eliminate the biases that in the past we do not focus on, like common method bias and endogenities and so on. A lot of journals have moved away from some very sort of basic theoretical advancement to a very in-depth use of theory. And this is also important for IJPDLM because we do see some submissions that mention theory but not really applying them. So the use of theory becomes very important if you want to use them. But then the next thing is analysis. There's a trend, some journals moving away from the typical survey-based covariance SEM to more econometrics, panel data-based analysis, that also become a trend in some journals. And next is relevance. Lots of journals started to ask the questions, if I publish a papers that only inform academic is really important, is really useful. Relevance to the practitioners, policymakers become new questions now. A lot of journals started to emphasize. So there is a change in the field. You can see some of the top tier journals in our field started to put much higher requirement in all this journal quality expectation. But Arjan wrote is right to say that we need to change the way we manage our data. Because in the past, we just rely on some basic interview data and some basic data from the shippers and the ports and so on, while we should go deeper into understanding. For example, if you want to track down logistic activities from manufacturers to the consumption point, you need to know the details on the use of energies and the route travels and all the different modes of transportation involved, etc. So that's a deeper understanding of the phenomenon comes from more reliable and also deeper understanding of all the different data. Unfortunately, our field is actually less cooperative in this way because we don't really have a way to share and use data. So I'd like to move on to then the discussion about the use of SEM. You can see some very heated debates about the use of PLS. In some journals, like Journal of Operation Management, they banned PLS, and in some other journals, they started to use PLS. So there's still debate in this area whether they are reliable or not reliable methods, and I think this is a good thing to see in our field, because in the past we only see research papers but no method paper. We should actually question the method we use, and we should continue the debate and investigations, and then use the appropriate methods for our research when needed. I'd like to move on to the other issues, bigger issues that we have started to address in our field, not just logistics and supply chain, but management and also other field, unethical and questionable research practices, on the rise of predatory journals or journals you can pay for to get published, and some of these citation practices. Citation gaming is becoming a very big issue in many journals, not just our field. And just to highlight to you what the publishers are doing here. This is just some examples where you can see some citation reporting organizations like Clarivate started to spot and identify journals that start to play game. They game the system by citing themselves, and you can see some journals here increasing impact factors by doing so. This has been ongoing for many years, but no one actually punished the journal. And June 2018 was one of these examples where the journals have been suppressed from the ranking. You remove from the ranking, that will be big consequence to the journal. And this thing continue. Another 33 journals being suppressed by again because there was serious self-citation by the journal and also by the authors and also citation stacking and so on. So they tell us that this is not going to be an easy thing to get past without being punished, and some of the journals that is close to our field has been now caught, and then everybody is actually started to realize that it's not something that we should continue doing. There are of course other questionable research practices like most serious one, you falsify data, or you p-hacking, means you only report significant result, and or you do hacking, means you explore the data and then only report data results that are favorable, and so on. We have quite a challenge in our field because most of our studies do not examine the data. The original data are not presented when you submit your journals, and no one examines your original data and how your original data are being used, and so on. We trust the authors that we have done what is necessary to verify the reliability of the data and so on. We also have issues where data are being reused without acknowledgement in our field, meaning that data can be used several times, but even the same sort of papers are analysis being published in different time. So that is a lot of challenges we face when it comes to how reliable our result can be. Why is it important? Now, if you think about some of the field where they have been really challenged by policymakers, climate change, for example, climate change scientists have been challenged by lots of policymakers about how reliable our science, and that drives them to be very transparent with the data, with their studies, with their study methods, and so on, and that drives them also to cooperate. And that hopefully, would happen to our field, because one day we have to be answerable to the recipient of our research, the policymakers and the practitioners. Another thing that is happening today is good and bad news. Good news is there are more and more journals in our field. Some of them are being classified as predatory because they make money. Okay, they emphasize self-interest and not really scholarship. And you can submit to your work to a journal like this, pay them, and they publish your work without any comments. That is an easy bit about getting a paper published, but then they are now being tracked by a lot of different authors and research group, and class them as being predatory, and publish this list of journals being classed as predatory by highlighting that they do not have transparency in their review process. They use aggressive method to increase the number of publications and so on. So to give you one example, some of the journals in our field, if you look at the publication they have 10 years back, they published 30-40 papers a year. Can you imagine a journal in our field publish 300 papers a year? How can you maintain the quality of the journal and so on, being able to publish 300 papers a year? So we have that kind of questions now in our field. So so sometimes we have to be careful in where you publish your papers as well. Now, a broader discussions about how to address some of these issues in our publication, how to govern our research. And so the first one is some of the new idea called open science. Open science is not the same as open access. Open science is about transparency of your data. So Ruth pointed out the importance of having more data, but it is also now important to recognize the data must be transparent. Where your data come from, what data are collected by your research, and so on. Beyond that, it is transparency about the method that you use, the code that you use to run your regressions, for example, and how you design your studies and so on. There's a new idea called study pre-registration, meaning that you pre-registers the different variables and method that you use to collect data, etc. That means you cannot actually change your research or your hypothesis after your pre-registration. And this has happened in different areas like biology, data science, psychology, political science. And it has now gone to some discussion in academic management. We know very well when it comes to AOM, they will start to go spread to other different journals in their circle of AOM, like MJ, MR, and so on. And slowly, psychology and so on will move on to our operation management area. The next kind of different changing sort of policy is at the institution level, where universities are starting to think about what we call responsible research and innovation. What does it mean? You can refer to in the AMJ papers by the editors here that what we want is produce high quality research that will make management and organization better for all. Better for all is not just better for big company. Better for all include better for society. So we want to be very mindful about our research. If we design a research and advise company to be able to make more money, we have to ask the next question: does that really benefit the environment in the society? So a lot of phrases come into this, like common goods and so on. If you are in the higher rank, asking your vice chancellors what is going on in the research policy, you might see some universities started to incorporate this into their research policy. So Ajahn will talk about impact, and this is something that we love and hate. I think ranking, ranking forced business school to act differently. They become very, anxious about how we can better rank, and there are so many rankings that give us a lot of pressures. But one of these new one is called impact ranking. You even have time hires trying to rank how well business school do research to address SDGs, and it is how they count. You can find out what time hires impact ranking is, and you'll find out what they measure. For example, they rank institutions against the SDG. And if you see your university names appear there, you'll be very proud and say, okay, well, university is known for addressing some of the SDGs. But if you see you are away from the other leaders, you might have to think, what you want to do with your university in terms of linking to SDG. So Ajahn Ruth is right pointing out that the university started to think about this more seriously. A bit more specific about what kind of SDGs most business schools address. We refer to Triple Crown School, and this is studied by Erasmus School of Management in Netherlands. They try to map the number of papers that fall into specific SDGs, and rightly so. Innovations and industries and so on is one of the most popular topic we study. We also look into decent work, economic growth, which is about how fair we treat workers, etc. We have done research on health related, which is a very important part of the societal benefit today. We also look into institutional political issues, issues like justice and peace in strong institutions, and then consumption, which is less compared to the others, but we should perhaps look into production and consumption because this is the nature of the supply chain ourselves. Now you can also see many other areas. We are in the educations, but we don't study so much education equality. We don't study so much gender equality, which is a very important issue to address. And there are many other issues that we can address. So on one hand, we know what we are focusing on good at. On the other hand, we actually can see there are a lot of opportunities for you to research in other areas. So in the first presentation, I talked about the purpose of cooperations, and then I had to just end my presentation by asking this question: what is the purpose of we doing research? Yes, all the business school, all the professors have a lot of pressure in publishing top-tier journals because we know that is perhaps the only way, the only important or most important criteria for you to get promoted. We can continue doing this by assuming that we can continue doing this kind of research by publishing in whatever top-tier journals or journal ranked in your institutions, assuming everything is normal, assuming the world will continue thrive and without any problems. Nothing is broken. We don't want to change the system. So what we do is optimize what we have today. We can optimize the efficiency in the supply chains, or we can increase the profitability for corporations, and that's kind of research we see mostly today. Okay, what are the kind of research that we should consider? Research that consider that we are human being and societies is under threat, existential threat, where we think our livelihood is on or at risk. For example, Jakarta is going to sink, or there will be serious drought in Vietnam, where we will have shortage of food to see, and there will be more flooding in Thailand, for example. We're seeing all these challenges. What do? We change our system. So the research that change our system is not the same as our past research that just optimize something. That means we have to engage in broader issues, not just the logistic and supply chain issues, but economical societal issues that we are facing today. So the purpose of research is now different because we want to not publish to get promotion, but we want to contribute to better lives, to inform what and how to change, but not just to inform how to improve, optimize something that we do not want to change. So my question is whether we are able to transform ourselves in the research arena to focus more on advancing theory that help to understand and support positive change. The change is the key word in here. I suggest, my opinion is that we should develop more theory of change rather than just using the existing theory we have. How can we change from a fossil fuel economy to a low energy, low fossil fuel or renewable energy supply chain? How can we achieve some of the more tricky sustainable development goals? And the research should not just about I want to test a theory to explain something, but the research to can I actually develop a model to predict change behavior? Can I actually explain how government policymakers can make change to enable us to create a better society, rather than just to explain, get better benefit? How can we support innovation, transformation of supply chain or the system? For example, we'll talk about food system. How can we change the food system in a way that there's no more increased chance of pandemic? So that's all my presentation up to now.
Thank you very much, Professor Wong, on your overview of IJPDLM and the research trend regarding to the journal perspective. So we have 3 or 4 questions here on the chat. So if anyone would like to just ask the question live. You just open the microphone, turn on the microphone, and then you can ask the question now. If you want to ask about the journal or something. Okay.
I see some question. Maybe I should address some of them.
I think the first one, what is the difference between circular supply chain and green supply chain?
When we use the word green supply chain, we usually focus on forward supply chain. We usually focus on cooperation with upstream and downstream supply chain members to address and to implement sustainable practices. We emphasize less on recycling and reverse logistic, reverse supply chain. But perhaps circular is a bit more comprehensive. It covers both. So a bigger picture.
Okay, thank you. Professor Ruth, one question for you. I think one student from Chiang Mai University asking about what is your opinion on logistic matters that affect economic growth, and it is possible to publish this kind of topic in the journal?
Okay, I think two things here. First one is research topic itself. If I understand correctly, it is more looking at it from a perspective of macro level logistics. But then if it is possible to publish it or not, the question will be, does it have rigor? Does it have validity? Does it have impact? You know, it's every topic is interesting, but at the end of the day, it's about how do you actually present and show that. So here in this case is, I would say probable. But I can't really say confirm 100% because I still haven't seen what the student has done in the research. So quite a difficult question to answer. But macro logistics is again another area where maybe more research is needed, logistics for policymakers and all these things. But then you start to go into this area of where the trade economists are very much involved. So you also have to be careful because you might be stepping on some other people's discipline.
Thank you. Professor Wong, does IJPDLM publish a paper using the quantitative model, mathematically model, operation research model? IJPDLM accept that kind of paper?
Normally, if you see a pure optimization OR kind of papers, that's reject because we are not good at it. But if you see an excellent research paper where this optimization is just part of demonstration that something can improve, and you have real action changes that take place following this model, yes, we would consider that kind of paper instead of a pure optimization mathematical modeling paper.
Okay, thank you. Another question from both of you. Talk about the resilient and risk management supply chain. She said actually it's not new due to uncertainty happened in the past. So the question is, what is the difference between past and now regarding the resilient or risk in supply chain and the issue that we need to combat? Past and now, what is the difference between past and now in relation to the resilient and risk supply chain management? And any issue, the difference between past and now?
The frequency, it comes back, I think, more and more often. In the past, such kind of event would happen and then would disappear. Maybe after a couple of years, there might be something else. But now we're seeing it's almost every day. So it is different now because you have to firefight on many fronts at the same time.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that's right. So in my presentation earlier, I said the disruption is not locally contained. It happens one place, it moves to another place. So you can go to one supplier to ask for some supply. They say yes, but 2 weeks later they say they cannot. and then you keep moving to another one because the pandemic spread across country, not follow your supply chain, but follow the travelers. So that means you can never have a quick fix, and you have to keep finding alternate solutions all the time. You have to contain your supply chain disruptions if you can, and you have to, in the past, you just need to ask your first tier, can you fix the problem? Now you cannot do that. That's not enough. You have to go to second, third tier and fix the problem yourself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Another question, I heard this question or the workshop I attend on the research in OM and supply chain. Regarding the theory used in OM and supply chain literature, well known like RBV, TCA, TCE, something like that, proposed before 2000s actually. So the question is there any emerging theory or borrow from other fields now in supply chain management, operation management field in recent years? Any emerging theory that you see in our field?
I think there are some, but we don't want to just name them and ask you to go for it, and that will be biased. First thing is, if you think about some of the old theory, RBV, TCE, you have room for this theory only if you go deeper. If you mention RBV and say all your capabilities are under RBV, it doesn't really help, because you want to help us to understand something deeper than briefly mentioning the theory. So that's principle apply to all the new theory that you want to apply. Now the theory that is more emerging, somehow one group of theory is more what we call middle range theory. So that is a departure from the grand theory. RBV is a grand theory, TCE, these are all grand theory. Grand theory explain things at a more macro abstract level. But our view is a bit more practical and more specific. So you have context. Now, how can you theorize things that has specific context? Context in the country, cultures, and logistics, and so on. And that means we have to go for something in the middle range theory. It is not a theory that tells you what to do, but it's a way to look at the abstract level of your theory and theory that consider context. When you say you want to give better insights to manager, that is what is required, because managers do not really want to listen to grand theory like RBV. If you have so and so characteristic in your resource, you'll be competitive. The manager will ask you, what do you mean by that? How do I do it? But the theory that look into context is the one that manager will appreciate and maybe make more sense for them to learn from us. So we should go down a bit more from the very abstract kind of theory to something more specific, more context bounded. The kind of research would perhaps be the one that I would prefer to see.
Thank you. Professor any thoughts?
Yeah, I think this question is interesting in the sense that it's like saying, oh, if you want to publish, you need to use this theory as a foundation, where in reality, shouldn't everything start from the research question, what you're trying to do and how, what type of theories can fit in. Another thing that I see, and IJPDLM, I think, was one of the first journal that talked about it, it may not be a theory, but it's a paper by Doug Naslund. I don't know if you remember, 2002, Logistics Need Action Research. I think this is an interesting paper, because it really shows a relationship between the researcher and the phenomenon under study and how they come up with solution. And then after multiple case study, then you can go up to the theory part, so on and so forth. So I think better not just, I know it's popular, and I remember going to doctoral workshop where everyone was talking about RBV, TC, and all these things. But at the end of the day, it really depends on what the research that you're doing.
Okay, okay, thank
Can I
you.
just add in here, just to echo what Ruth said? Just one advice about how you make your paper interesting. If you start with theory, you must, of course, highlight there is a problem in the theory to understand the real world. But I actually prefer what Ruth said. You tell me what problems are addressed and facing the managers. More the phenomenon to start with. You want to really address a problem that managers cannot answer or address. You start from there, then you ask yourself a question: do we have a theory to help them understand? Rather than starting with lots of broad statements about this theory, that theory, that is not going to help you to let the editors understand what real world problem you are trying to address.
Okay, very fruitful discussion and very good session for today from both our panelists. But the football match must be over, so we don't have any more time for this. But I think in the future, if you have any questions, I think you can email me, and then I can send the contact to. I mean, send the question to Professor Bong or Professor Ruth, so we can keep continuing on this discussion after we finish this one. So, Dr. Kelta, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, please, I will hand the stage for you to say something before we finish today.
Well, actually, all of you has discussed a lot of things on here, and I hope that everyone who joined this session will get some more knowledge and have a way to publish to the top journal, like the journal that Dr. Chiyu is an editor. Okay. And if you have any questions or you want us to set up any other meeting like this, I think as a department head and also Thammasat Business School, we are happy to do so in the later time. Thank you, Dr. Thakun, for arranging this. And thank you, Dr. Shiyu, for spending your morning with us. We have a fruitful talk, as Dr. Sakun said, and thank you, Dr. Ruth, for being here with us today. Thank you.
Can I?
Thank you for
Yes.
inviting me.
Yes, Ruth.
Yes, can I say one last word?
Yeah.
My first paper that I published from my PhD was with IJPDLM, 2001, multimodal transport. By that time, the editor was Jim Stock. So just want to share that with everyone, that I also have a long history with IJPDLM. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, everyone stay safe, and then hope we can meet each other again in the future. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
ขอบคุณครับพี่รุ่นครับ
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.